Well, so welcome everyone to Grand Rounds, Medicine Grand Rounds for this week. I'm very, very excited to introduce to you some prominent speakers who have been willing to join us today to have a conversation about the role of the FDA during epidemics and pandemics. So we are lucky enough to be joined by Dr. Luciana Borio, who's the Vice President of In-Q-Tel. She previously served as Director for Medical and Biodefense Preparedness at the National Security Council from 2017 to 2019. And then from 2010 to 2017, she worked at the US FDA, where she served as the Assistant Commissioner for Counterterrorism Policy and Director of the Office of Counterterrorism and Emerging Threats, and then as Acting Chief Scientist. Joining her will be Dr. Jesse Goodman, who directs the Center on Medical Product Access, Safety, and Stewardship, or COMPASS, at Georgetown, where he's Professor of Medicine and attending physician in infectious disease. He previously served at the FDA as its chief scientist between 2009 and 2014, and director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research from 2003 to 2009. And before that was chief of infectious diseases at the University of Minnesota. We're going to run this Grand Rounds as a conversation between these two, moderated by our own Dr. Carlos Del Rio, who needs no introduction to this group. And he will, Dr. Del Rio will pepper our experts with some questions that I think are very relevant today to understanding the landscape with the FDA, EUAs, as we've heard, for not only vaccines, but convalescent plasma and other drugs related to COVID-19 and pandemic responsiveness. And so, Dr. Del Rio, I will turn this over to you to moderate this discussion. At the end of the discussion, for our audience, we will have the opportunity for questions, and so please put your questions in chat, and I will ask those to our speakers. So, Dr. Del Rio, let me have you take it from here.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Armstrong, and again, thank you and to our speakers. Very grateful that you're able to join us. You know, as we are entering the 10th month of this pandemic, we all want vaccines, we all want treatments. And the US FDA plays a critical role in approving tests, medications, vaccines, devices, and therefore has a central role in a medical emergency such as this pandemic. And many of us have heard, maybe for the first time, about the FDA issuing emergency use authorizations, and we've seen EUAs for diagnostic tests, for drugs like hydroxychloroquine, for convalescent plasma. And as vaccine trials are progressing, we have observed how the FDA has been under intense political pressure to approve as soon as possible a vaccine. And many have been worried about that, about the credibility of the FDA and the scientific validity of the FDA. In today's Grand Rounds, we will have a conversation with two former FDA chief scientists who will help us understand what the approval process is at the FDA, what an EUA is, when is it appropriate, and what role the FDA plays during epidemics and pandemics, learning from the past. So thank you very much, and I'll go and start the first question, and we'll start with Dr. Borio. And can you briefly tell us about yourself, or your career, and how you get to be an FDA scientist?
Sure, I'm an ID physician. I trained at Johns Hopkins, so that's my home base. And before 9/11, I began to work in biodefense at the Center for Health Security, what's today the Center for Health Security, with John Bartlett and Dave Henderson. And post 9/11, I went over to work at HHS to support the buildup of what's today's, biodefense enterprise. That many, many years ago. But the highlight of my career since actually had been working under Jesse Goodman. He was my boss at the FDA during 2009 pandemic. We have many stories together. It was a time of tremendous, growth and learning, and we had a lot of fun. I think we did a lot of good work together. But that's, for me, working at the FDA really stemmed from a tremendous admiration for the mission and the people that I got to work with when I was at HHS. It was, I always felt that there was the reputation of the FDA and, as being, stubborn and backwards in science and not cutting edge thinking, progressively. I thought it was quite the opposite when I actually encountered the staff, that they actually were very visionary, very cutting edge, and at the same time really balanced well the need for safety and protecting the public health. And that intrigued me so much that I decided to make the jump to work at the FDA.
So Jesse, why don't you tell us about you, how you got to the FDA?
Well, first of all, thank you for that compliment, Luciana. The pleasure was all mine to work together with you. But I was an academic ID physician with a laboratory doing clinical trials and all that, and running the infectious disease division at University of Minnesota. And sort of for family reasons, long story, we're looking at going and spending some time in Washington. And at that time, I had put together one of the early antimicrobial stewardship programs at Minnesota, and got very involved in that, and was really struck that there was not much going on nationally. This was in about 98 or so. So I actually looked around and went and talked to CDC and NIH and FDA leadership at that point. And actually FDA leadership said, we would love you to take on antimicrobial resistance at a national level. I proposed putting together that first task force. And that was kind of how I ended up at FDA, running antimicrobial resistance activities. And then I say that a 2 or 3 year sabbatical turned into about 15 years, because just like Luciana, I found an incredible opportunity to have impact on the health of American people, a wonderful group of people, and ended up staying until 2014.
Well, that's really interesting. And I think you touch on a very important point, which is most clinicians have no idea what the role the FDA does, yet FDA is critical in, approving devices and medications and vaccines. So give us a little bit of background of how the FDA process is and what do they do?
You want me to start with that?
Yeah, you can start. If I'm a company,
okay.
I'm a company and take something to you.
Yeah. So, for medical devices, I'll leave food aside. It's a whole other thing, but it's very important. But for today's discussion, unless there are questions, I'll leave it aside. But for medical devices, for biologics, which includes vaccines and biologic drugs and the blood supply, and for regular drugs, basically, you need approval to market these things in the United States. And there is essentially a scientific process around those approvals. And maybe I'll give vaccines as an example, since it's one that we're focusing on here, but for drugs, it's fairly similar, which is that before a manufacturer wants to even do clinical trials, as many of your listeners who've been involved in clinical trials know, you have to apply to the FDA for what's called an IND, or investigational new drug permission, which essentially says that FDA assesses the preclinical science that might be available, the chemistry of the compound, and says, is it safe to proceed with studies in humans, and does your study design protect human subjects, and also make it that we're going to get useful knowledge out of a study. So that's sort of phase one, the first in human studies. Then if those go okay and FDA monitors that, you have the larger studies, which are typically about dose finding and in vaccines immunogenicity, phase two, often in the hundreds of patients. And then if things succeed through that, the phase 3 trials. Meanwhile, there's all the non-clinical development going on, animal testing, quality, manufacturing process. A lot of that is not always visible to the public, but a critical part, especially with biologics and vaccines, is having really strong control over manufacturing and quality. So every single dose of vaccine is just like the ones that were in the clinical trials and of the highest quality. So that encapsulates that. If a product is then approved, and typically for a novel product, it's brought to one of the public advisory committees before approval for outside expert input and public transparency. But then if the product is approved, there is also typically a post-approval monitoring system, which can range from passive reporting for many drugs to very active surveillance for some of the vaccines. So I think that kind of encapsulates it, and I'll hold it at that in terms of the normal processes, which differ from what we do in a public health emergency.
Right. So Dr. Borio, we all know that, for example, right now, when any trial, for that matter, when you get to that phase 3, you have to submit the protocol to the FDA for review. And how does the FDA evaluate, for example, right now in a protocol, a vaccine protocol, to say you can go this way, you can't? What is the process that they follow looking at the protocol?
Sure. So, and just to build a little bit on Jesse's answer too, that there are 3 distinct medical product centers at FDA that deal with, drugs, biologics, and devices. And I think something that I think most people don't know until they work there is that the review team works as a team. And there are clinicians, there are scientists, there are product specialists, statisticians. And it's a very rich, group, so that it can actually get the most incredible expertise as you shepherd a product through the review process. The protocols, well, most of it is, what FDA communicates in guidance, and what Jesse mentioned. It really is making sure that the trial is designed in an optimal way to protect the safety of volunteers and to yield the interpretable data that we would like to have at the end, on the other side when the trial is complete. That it has internal, that there's a statistical analysis plan that is, valid, and that importantly, the sponsor has plans about how is it going to actually have product made available for the clinical trials, but afterwards as well, right? So if a company, for example, has a tremendous amount of challenges in manufacturing their product, it doesn't make sense, but they have sufficient product for a large phase 3 study, it may not make sense for them to proceed if they have not really resolved the issues around manufacturing. So it's a complex set of issues that have to be assessed, but it's a lot of expertise that goes into it, and there's tremendous amount of dialogue between FDA and the sponsors too.
Carlos, I would just add one thing to that, because I think it's very important, which those of us who get our science typically about products from medical journals, et cetera, don't realize, is that also those same review teams of basic scientists, let's say virologists, clinicians, manufacturing scientists, statisticians that are looking at a vaccine have also looked at the last 10. And there's tremendous experience across many of them, so that there's a lot of data brought to bear that may not be about that specific product. So I wanted to bring that up as well.
No, that's a really good point, because again, it's really all about the expertise and the track record and knowing what you're doing. So let's move on to this whole issue of emergency use authorization. Can you briefly tell us why are they important? How are they established, and what are the requirements? How is it different from an approval?
Luciana,
I'll start, and then we'll tag team again. So, they were initially established by Project BioShield Act in 2004. But, it was FDA authorities were amended over the years through cycles of legislation related to biodefense. That includes the 21st Century Cures Act in 2017, the other one known as PAPRA in 2013. And most recently, there is a DoD-specific one which added agents of war if it's for DoD purposes. So the EUA itself allows the FDA to authorize the use of unapproved product, or, this is a mind bender, an unapproved use of an approved product. And that one is a mind bender because most physicians are so accustomed to the idea of off-label use. But for the FDA, there's unapproved use of an approved product constitutes an approved use and requires an EUA, and we can get into that, why that matters. So it allows FDA to authorize the broad distribution with certain stipulations of those products in a way that is a lot more flexible than access through other mechanisms. And I like to think about EUA as an access mechanism, right? So people can actually access investigational products through clinical trials. It's still an access mechanism. They can access unapproved products through expanded access mechanisms, whether it's individual, intermediate size, or larger. And then the EUA is the one where it's the most flexible, because the major difference is that obviates the need for informed consent and IRB review. Even though there's a duty to informed, you really bring it outside of the clinical trial paradigm once you are in the EUA. And Jesse, do you want to?
Yeah, one thing I would say is that this grew out of some of the challenges that occurred, for example, after the anthrax attacks, where certain things that made a lot of sense in a horrendous emergency were very difficult to do, like pre-positioning stockpiles of these drugs, or using certain antibiotics, which we knew worked for anthrax, but had never been in controlled clinical trials. So there were things that clearly, as we entered this age of both bioterrorist emergencies, but also the reality of epidemics and outbreaks, that FDA needed flexibilities, but they really were envisioned around emergencies. And I think one of the things that's come out, for example, with this pandemic, is we have some things that happen that don't exactly fit that paradigm, like the use of a vaccine in a pandemic. That's not the same as a nerve gas attack or an inhalation anthrax attack, yet still it probably calls for options that may allow earlier access to certain products. Like you look at diagnostics, both in 2009 with H1N1 and now with, SARS coronavirus 2, there's an incredible need for those diagnostics to come out quickly. And so the EUA allows flexibility rather than waiting for 1,000 patient clinical trials to get things out there, but it was never intended also to substitute. The idea is to carry these products forward and get the data needed to approve them. So I think that's all important background. Another thing about the EUA is the public looking at it now, and with all this pressure and this really questionable EUA for hydroxychloroquine, people say, my God, this is like opening the barn door. It really, in a way, was intended to give FDA more control and be able to require that real data be there rather than things just be used willy-nilly. Like after the anthrax attacks, we saw pressure to use completely unproven things in a willy-nilly manner. And the EUA at least requires FDA to do an assessment of benefit and risk. So that's an important protection if it's not abused.
Yeah, and let me just add a little bit more in terms of the uses, because right now we're seeing it as a shortcut, or instead of the randomized controlled clinical trials, which are so important. I want to give a shout out to Anish Mehta at Emory, actually, who is done an incredible job in making sure we do the right science for these emergencies. But in addition to that, there are instances where an EUA is really absolutely helpful. For example, dispensing without a prescription, which may happen in an emergency where you don't, for a large-scale antibiotic distribution. Also for a new age group during 2009 pan flu. Remember, Jesse, when it was oseltamivir was not approved for very, very small children, infants. And there was some scientific data, some work had been done to support with PKPD to support a dosing scheme, but it was an unapproved product and not normally used for that very young population. And an EUA would have been a mechanism to facilitate in a science-based manner the use of the product in population for unmet need, and that had this unmet need. The product can be used beyond the labeled expiration if there is suggestions that the product may still be potent and stable. So there are many utilities of the EUA that go beyond what I think is in most people's minds day to day, which is this idea of let's use it before we have the data we need regarding safety and effectiveness as a shortcut to get in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think you made a very good points about the fact that it allows people to use it, but it also allows the opportunity for the FDA to have a little more control and to proceed with clinical trials and get data, right? So it's not just about just open the floodgates, but in fact, maybe a way to have a little more control over a process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, I mean, Luciana, you can disagree, but we never experienced pressure about EUAs. These were things that arose out of the consensus of the scientific and public health community that there was a need. And then FDA was allowed to objectively evaluate the product. So what's been going on is really unfortunate and really, new territory. I just want to say that.
Yeah, so I think that makes it interesting. So when you go back and you think, I mean, think about some examples, you mentioned, we talked briefly about 2009 pandemic flu. We talked about, a little bit about anthrax. I assume that the fluoroquinolone approval for anthrax was an EUA. But are there other examples, like, for example, in Zika and Ebola, other things that were done that, and again, you're looking at the data more of the need to do it rather than the political pressure to do it, right? And, anthrax was clearly political. There's no doubt about that.
So, Jesse may want to get started I think the first real use outside of anthrax was during pandemic flu. And then I was there afterwards during Ebola and Zika. And I'll be happy to add what happens afterwards, because, we learned so much from each emergency and we adapted our views on those authorities. And it may be helpful to walk through some of those so that you understand some of the trade-offs.
Yeah, I think in H1N1, other than the pressure and the sort of politicization of science and the fracturing of the national consensus that we've seen, minor points. Other than that, in many ways, H1N1 was, a less severe version of what we're dealing with now. But we were able to use the EUAs, for example, to get diagnostics out very quickly. And one thing we did then, which I think contrasts to what happened early, is we recognized we shouldn't just rely on the government or CDC for a diagnostic, but we tried to bring in manufacturers to get these diagnostics up on their platforms. But one thing FDA was able to do, working with CDC and NIH and others, was say, can we make samples available to diagnostic developers? Let's put out templates that make it easier for them to come in with these applications. And the Device Center has ended up doing that, and that's why we see now a plethora of at least the detection tests. But that was one example. Most of the therapeutics, there's only been one other vaccine EUA, and that was a complicated technical issue where basically there was a lot of opposition to the anthrax immunization program in the DoD, and a federal judge declared that FDA's original approval of anthrax had not been completed, so declared what FDA viewed at that time as an approved product as unapproved. So the EUA was used as a temporary measure to keep the product available. But there's never been another vaccine EUA. We took the pathway in the 2009 pandemic of handling that as a strain change, because the manufacturing process was the same as what's done with seasonal vaccine. So that was a much lower risk situation and a much, where we had a very reassuring safety database on these products. So, but what I was also going to say is that the therapeutics EUAs, for example, on oseltamivir for younger age group, I think there was an IV zanamivir EUA, which is another, which is the Relenza. And there was also an investigational drug called peramivir. Those were based, even though that didn't end up working better than what we had, those were based on very solid, scientific data that led the agency to make a favorable risk-benefit basis and decision.
Yeah, so the peramivir story, I think, was a really important lesson that we experienced and made us really rethink, how we address these drugs in a subsequent emergency, because it made perfect sense, right? The statutory authority was there, the benefits outweighed the risk. There was substantial amount of data from phase 2 clinical studies for peramivir. I think that the N had been more than 2,000 patients, perhaps, in RCTs, phase 1, phase 2. There's a good mechanism of action. Everything was, fell into it can check all the boxes. And then the product was made available under an EUA. And what happened was that it took the company more than 2 years to conduct an RCT that eventually showed that it was no better than, I forget exactly the conclusion, but it was not
same as oseltamivir.
It was not inferior to oseltamivir. Yeah. Thank you. And, and then you realize, my God, we gave this product to so many people, and it took the company so much longer when the potential for studying very quickly had been during the pandemic, when so many people actually, there was, so many, they had such a hard time enrolling patients and they had to go through several flu seasons. But during the pandemic, enrollment, patients were everywhere. And we would have been able to know very quickly whether this product was affording a benefit or not. I don't know, I'm not second guessing the decision at the time, but I'm just saying that this really brought us to rethink how we approached it. That, really brought home the idea that if you can conduct a proper randomized controlled study in an emergency, that's the way we ought to do things, because that's how you establish definitively and hopefully in a way that actually so fast that you can actually alter the trajectory of the emergency by promoting drugs that actually work and stopping the use of those that don't as quickly as possible.
So brings me to the point. So you issue an EUA. How do you rescind an EUA?
Yeah, it's really, you try not to issue one, first of all, because it's much harder to rescind. But, and I'll get to that. I mean, some EUAs are still in place for Ebola diagnostic tests, for Zika diagnostic tests, and it's really hard. So once the gene's out of the box, it's very hard for the manufacturers to actually do the studies that needed to be able to, because it's not the end goal, right?
Right.
So Ebola came around and, there was tremendous pressure to be able to use these products under an EUA. And the US government at the time made a decision, and Jesse wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine, the article on ZMapp and the secret serum, there was a very limited dose of that drug, very limited dose. And really there was not even an ethical issue on RCTs, because you could conduct the RCTs, because there was it's not like you're depriving people of the amount of doses. And anyway, but the U.S. government made a decision that they're going to go and do RCTs for vaccines and therapeutics, and that's what happened. And it really changed the way we thought we would then manage these public health emergencies for good. That we would do everything to establish the infrastructure to be able to ascertain what products work and they don't. And then once you had definitive evidence of safety and efficacy, that then you would consider the EUA to facilitate access to products that actually are safe in lives and are harming, until all the process for licensure, there's a bureaucratic process, and Jessica can talk about that, so that would follow on for a few months, but that the EUA would only be issued once you had this clear data from RCTs.
So now we are, we enter now pandemic, COVID, COVID pandemic, and we see the FDA issuing EUAs, and there's obviously all the diagnostic tests have EUAs, the hydroxychloroquine EUA, the convalescent plasma EUA, and we continue to see this process. And the question is, do you think, for example, we'll ever get an answer? And you talked a little bit about this in clinical trials from convalescent plasma. Now that we have an EUA, that will have increased access. Do you think that there will be a way to actually have data that will help us guide what the EUA did?
Yeah, this is a really important question, and I think it points out two ways in which the system and the way it's been implemented in this pandemic have not lived up to what I would like to see. Okay, one is that, with some exceptions, in this country, despite the lessons of Ebola and all the work we did on that, this country was not ready to rapidly mobilize RCTs on the most promising therapies. So with the exception of the remdesivir trial, which NIH helped in, not much went on for a long time. And you can see in contrast that the UK, with the recovery trial, the WHO, et cetera, set up these multi-arm, rapidly adaptive trials. And that's what gave us dexamethasone, probably the most important advance so far. So I really think as Lou said, we learn from every event, but I think our government, part of this is we don't have a functioning healthcare system to rapidly mobilize trials in, but that's something we need to fix. NIH and others should be prepared to run multi-arm trials immediately in a pandemic of the most important things to test, and those should be organized. We shouldn't have 60 or 70 institutional trials of hydroxychloroquine, which don't end up giving us an answer. So that's been one failure. The other is that I think FDA, these two EUAs we've seen, and in fact, the expanded access program to plasma before the EUA, when those are put in place without that clinical trial going strongly, then we're sort of, robbing Peter to pay Paul, and we're get in this situation where getting the data is really, really hard. This isn't just a thing in emergencies. So for example, with cancer treatment, there's always tremendous pressure to give treatment outside of clinical trials and expanded access programs. But FDA is used to balancing those things to assure the trial gets done. And I think that really fell down in this pandemic, and that others around the world have done a much better job.
Yeah, can I add a few things on the speed with, so I totally, Jess and I completely agree this idea that if we really want to see clinicians, we can lament the state of affairs, but for as long as RCTs are so complicated to be conducted and there's no, we're not leveraging the most amazing EHR systems we have, and, to do healthcare system rapidly adaptive, randomized controlled trials that can, more seamlessly enroll patients. I think UPMC is trying to do more like what recovery has done. Anyway, we need to focus on this whole infrastructure. But I also think that there's this misconception that RCTs are not efficient, or that RCTs are too slow. There's a bias towards thinking that if it's the gold standard, we have to to set it aside for the emergency because we need to react more quickly. And I think it's important to recognize that for emergent infectious diseases, it is the most efficient and definitive way for us to ascertain what works and what doesn't and what harms. There's just no way around. We looked at this and examined this carefully. National Academy of Medicine did a whole study on this, and of course, one can also lament the state of oncology development because we're getting a lot of drugs approved that may not necessarily, meet the bar. But for oncology, when you have a cancer, that the only way it goes, it progresses. I don't have to, preach to the choir for this audience. You can still sometimes derive interpretable data from observational studies. But for an emergent infectious disease where there's such a you know very little about the disease, you know very little about the drugs that are being used sometimes, and the mortality tends to decrease over time as doctors learn how to care for patients better, and access to health is better, and the provision of healthcare is better. And the fact, there's so many complications around doing the studies, doing a rapidly evolving public health emergency, that we really need to accept and put aside this idea that RCTs take too long, because it's not the truth.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the things that to me was striking is how I would have expected China to come out with some very clear data of randomized trials, et cetera. Maybe they were just overwhelmed, but the science that came out of China were primarily just observational studies. I mean, we didn't see, and even, they tried to do a plasma study, but by the time they did it, they had no longer had patients. I mean, it seems like the studies were simply, I don't have one study from China that I can say what I can say about the recovery or what I can say about, Act 1. It's just very different. And maybe we need better international trial collaboration.
They kind of did what we did. They allowed a whole bunch of investigator-initiated trials. There was prestige in this is what I've heard, in every single scientist or institute or clinician wanting to have a paper published or do a study, so it became study-oriented rather than outcome-oriented. And I think that's part of the problem with our system, as well as the fragmentation of the health system. But I often try to point out to people, for example, on convalescent plasma, we had this whole controversy around the data used to support the EUA, from 70,000 people or whatever. Well, I did some sample size calculations, and if the effect was what they were claiming, we could have had that from a randomized controlled trial of just a few thousand people or maybe less, and we could have had that months before. So yet some of the most vociferous opposition that I hear to randomized controlled trial is from scientists and physician scientists, which sort of shocks me, who, in the heat of the moment become completely convinced that something worked for them, or in certain cases have, personal or financial conflicts, unfortunately. So I think, this is one of the reasons Lou and I are both very proud of some of the work we did at FDA and that our colleagues are doing now, which is, when everybody else is going crazy, the FDA can kind of be calm and objective. And that's a very important role it should play for our public health and medical community. It's in jeopardy right now, but it's just so important.
It's interesting because, having, cut my teeth in HIV and HIV research, I've seen how if it hadn't been for well-organized, randomized clinical trials, we would not be where we are right now in HIV therapeutics and in HIV prevention and other things. Simply clinical trials took us where they are, and very well-conducted clinical trials have dramatically changed the outcome for patients. And we would have never been there. We had just relied on, companies and investigators doing their own thing.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that we do need to create a better infrastructure, and we need to make the trials a lot easier to do. And there's stuff that FDA can do, and I think it has done in an emergency to maybe, strip away some of the complexities, make national consent an easier kind of approach, just to not make record keeping easier. So I think this is kind of it might be a future NAM project, for example. Let's build the clinical research enterprise of emergencies for the future. My relative Nikki Lurie and Tom Frieden and Francis Collins wrote about this after the 2009 pandemic, but we still haven't really done it in this country. We need that infrastructure. The other thing, it's not just for sexy new therapies, okay? Look how much has been improved by figuring out about proning patients. But do we have a national trial yet of who should be anticoagulated and when with COVID? No. So we also need those trials about medical care, which isn't considered sexy by either companies or, frankly, NIH.
But it improves outcomes. Or maybe
right. Sometimes it makes them worse. So I think
exactly.
Some of the things people did in this pandemic made people worse.
So let's move on to this whole issue of now vaccines. And I think about, there are many vaccines. The vaccine race is heating up. There are a lot of vaccines and phase 3 trials. You talked about, past experience. We're now looking at vaccines, whether it's adenovirus vector vaccines or mRNA vaccines we've never approved before. So there's no track record. How does that play into the whole picture?
Jess, you want to start? I think you're muted though.
Why don't you go first, Luciana?
Okay. So, I think that it's fascinating to see how fast actually that we were able to put together these incredible technologies, portfolio of technologies. And one, they don't happen by accident, right? They really are a result of decades of investments by the U.S. biomedical research enterprise, including DoD and DARPA and all those. And then I think that there's been a tremendous amount of focus by the biodefense enterprise, many flaws there, but amount of focus on trying to get to design a new product as quickly as possible, which really calls for the importance of having the infrastructure then to study it just as efficiently. Okay, so I just want to, again, emphasize that point that we may end up with a situation, kind of scientific, sci-fi, where you have the drug within a week, but then, you still have to study it, and we need to be able to transform the trials. But so yeah, I think it's really exciting to see that so many companies now come together, have candidates already in phase 3. A lot of it has to do with lessons learned from prior emergencies. FDA really making sure that the process is driven by data instead of by phases of the clinical study. So that we during both flu and Ebola, we said, what are the if a candidate, if a sponsor knows how to dose the drug, then if we have enough information about how to properly dose, then you don't need to do things in certain sequence, right? You don't have to do a phase 1 clinical study that is going to take another 6 to 12 weeks in an emergency. Or why not? How efficient can you make those trial designs so that they can actually and some companies call their phases phase 2/3. Some companies called it phase 1/2, and then they went to phase 3. But I think it just reflects that the data, available data, is driving the process. And I think that it was, it's great that they're doing RCTs, of course, because, we couldn't have it any other way. It's unfortunate that we couldn't get them all working together to do a large vaccine study like what WHO had proposed initially. We are able to, at least for the ones being supported by the US government, there's a common DSMB and there's a common set of assays that will be used to evaluate immunogenicity and all. But again, missed opportunities to be able to make it the most, to make the process as efficient as possible. And there are a lot of uncertainties, about these new technologies, and we're going to have to address them step by step. And some uncertainties will take time to understand. There's some things are just non-compressible. Some timelines are compressible and some are not compressible. And I think that's where it gets really complicated to communicate to the public and to physicians about, we can have the gold standard for this trial because we're doing the RCT with clinical endpoints, and that's the gold standard. But you still have information that is not, available just because you did this gold standard RCT for a vaccine, and it'll take time to sort them out.
Yeah, and to your question, Carlos, that these are the ones fastest out of the chute are relatively new technologies, and they haven't been in approved vaccines. So we do not have the safety record of millions of people, over not just a couple of months, but over years. So while there haven't been red flags really in these trials, although we don't know much about the one serious adverse event reported, we just don't have the time and experience to know this. So you're in a higher risk situation than we were with, say, 2009 H1N1. And I think this is part of what's making FDA appropriately cautious, wanting to put out a guidance that apparently has been held up, on the EUAs, et cetera. So people shouldn't forget that. And it's not just these are new vaccine technologies, it's a new disease. So there's this whole concern about, could there be vaccine-mediated enhancement of disease, which has been seen, for example, with dengue or with some RSV vaccines. So there's a lot of unknowns here, and that's why we have to do the science and give it time to play out. And, even if it was approved using the FDA gold standard, we had clinical trials going out, let's say a year or something, we may not know everything then about the technology or the safety profile of the vaccine. That's another reason there's going to have to be, I've been really harping on a very strong safety surveillance system that, whether it's under an EUA or approved, tracks in real time using electronic health records, CMS data, et cetera, the safety of these vaccines.
We think about 1979, swine flu vaccine. We think about, what happened with rotavirus vaccine in intussusception, that it was really, intussusception wasn't really seen only after millions of doses had been given because it was such a rare event, yet it was critically to pick it up. So that post-vaccine surveillance is going to be really very important here. So could you, since you touch on it, could you sort of briefly, political pressure notwithstanding, when the FDA commissioner and FDA came up with a stricter guideline for EUA, what were they trying to do? Was this about safety, or was this about ensuring the scientific process?
So the one that is at play that the press has reported right on, that there's a guidance. So FDA developed a guidance, and to make it more clear to the sponsors that, what is it that they're expecting before a vaccine is authorized for use under an EUA. There have been some CEOs, that have been very public about their desire to file for an EUA by October. And the FDA, in their understanding all this that, of course, just explained, they realized that would not be prudent or safe, and that we needed to have a little bit more follow-up, safety follow-up, than what would be available by the time that a DSMB might declare a trial, a vaccine safe based on interim analysis. Okay, so and the protocols are pretty aggressive actually for the companies. But anyway, so FDA developed this guidance, and it sends over to it has to be cleared by the commissioner and then HHS, and then it goes to the White House for review. At least usually would have been a communication, and then this time around they have the office of a part of OMB, tiny office that deals with regulations, reviewing clinical guidance, which is highly unusual. And the fact is that the guidance is being held up at this point. And I don't know that it really, in a way, matters to what the FDA does, because the career scientists at FDA Office of Vaccines have made it clear what they expect. They have continued to articulate it to the sponsors. But it is very disturbing. I think it really erodes trust that you have this, a political system now trying to interfere with what traditionally has been a purely scientific decision. And it's that one of the things that I was always very proud, not to detract from the way we responded to the emergencies that may not have been quite visible to the public, is it was always a very scientifically driven response. There are always political sensitivities that have to be addressed. It may require the issue of quarantine of healthcare workers during Ebola, and governors making decisions to or not to isolate them when they came back home. There are political sensitivities, but the decisions always were driven by the best available science. And this time around, the decisions are not being driven by the best available science. They're decisions that are clearly as a result of political interference.
So you touched on it, and I think I want to end with that part of the discussion, which is, how do we maintain trust in the system? How do we ensure that, the FDA decisions will be made based on science and not political interference?
I think that, people are taking a number of steps to try to push back on some of the damage that's been done and, provide what reassurance to the public that we can. So, FDA has said it will bring any EUA or approval that it proposes to its public advisory committee. This is the VRPAC, or the Vaccine Related Advisory Committee. So there's going to be a chance for outside input. The head of the center has said that if he were made to the CBER, which I directed years ago, that if he were asked to make a decision that he wasn't comfortable with, he would resign. The head of Operation Warp Speed has made a similar statement. I mean, what's terrible is that anybody should even have to make these statements. But I think it's going to be, it's like so much else that's going on right now. It's going to be the vigilance and support of the scientific and public health community saying, we demand FDA be allowed to have its independent process. We demand the appearance at the advisory committee and then ultimately refer to CDC's advisory committee on immunization practices for recommendations. We also demand transparency on the data. So not just that it come to a committee, but that the key data and all the important data are publicly presented. So I think that at this point, you sort of have to fight pressure with pressure on the other side. In the long term, are there structural things that we may need to do to immunize the system against this kind of pressure? I think it definitely is going to bear a lot of thought. One other thing we haven't mentioned about EUAs is the public confuses them with approvals. Authorization kind of sounds like approval. Even people like Luciana and I can't always keep it 100% straight when we're talking. So, I think the transparency around an EUA is going to be critical. That physicians need to help their patients understand if it's not an approved product, number one, that it isn't, so they know that and understand that. And number two, why? It could be something trivial, like a certain data file is going to take 2 months to put together and validate. It could be something easy to understand, like the early endpoints are really strong and we have enough safety data, but we don't have the later endpoints. But if it's anything else, people need to know and they need to understand that. So I think this is a case where we need transparency now. We need an absolute fight against any pressure or coercion on FDA. We need the leadership of FDA to stand up. One of the things that can happen is you're under all this pressure all the time, and it can influence what you do, and we just don't want that to happen. I don't know if Luciana, you want to add.
No, I think that says it all. Thank you, Jesse.
No, that really summarizes it, and I think it makes it very clear that, I think that knowing that the quality of the people at FDA are the ones, and I think what we need to do is we need to trust the science, and we need to trust the people at FDA and let them do the right decisions, because that's how the system works best, right? When we let the science guide the decision, and as you say, we need transparency, we need that data to become available so we can all take a look at it and see what happens, because clearly there's going to be, there should be data that we can all look at some point in time, and that we can all look.
Speaking of the people at FDA, the people that are responsible for reviewing vaccines at the FDA, they've done this, they dedicated their life to vaccines. They're highly experienced, and they really care very much about this. They understand their responsibility, and the vaccine is a product given to healthy people who are healthy to begin with. And I think that, I think we can all be grateful for that, for the strength of that team. But they will need external support that Jesse mentioned, because they're ready to take on this fight, but they can't be alone.
Well, thank you. I want to thank both of you. This was a great discussion, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Armstrong to see if there's questions she has from the audience that she wants to pose at this point.
Thank you so much. That's been a fantastic discussion. There are a couple from the audience. I was going to ask quickly, as far as trying to ensure transparency and so on, do statements like those made by the some pharmaceutical companies sort of pledging more transparency, is that helpful, or is that really still influenced by sort of other forces and not helpful?
I think it's helpful. I think the statements could have gone further, and I think we'll have to see the behavior back up the statements. But I think it's extraordinary, and I think particularly companies that already are making vaccines and, are very familiar with how important public trust is, are quite concerned. They're concerned about their other products, their reputation. When you make MMR vaccine or something, you're concerned that you like being part of a solution so that children don't have measles and die of measles. So I think no one wants to see a threat to public trust of vaccines or to their reputation. So I do think it's helpful.
Dr. Stevens, our chair, has asked in the chat, can you comment on the roles of the independent DSMBs for oversight of safety and efficacy in the interface with the FDA? And with that, he also thanks you for your excellent comments.
Jesse, what did you take? I'm not sure how the DSMB interfaces with the FDA. You may know. I don't think.
Yeah, I think it can vary based on how the DSMB functions, but what I would say is that, in a way, the FDA, for routine issues, will often defer to the DSMBs, looking at data and this and that. But when there are serious adverse events that raise questions about a trial, so for example, this question of transverse myelitis in one of the trials, that's the kind of thing that FDA will not necessarily just de facto accept the DSMB's evaluation of, but is probably going to be looking at the data. So I think the most important thing the DSMB is a layer of protection that's looking at safety data. Because it has rules about interim analyses, it's a layer of protection in a sense on the quality of the efficacy data. But at the end of the day, it's FDA that makes the decisions about whether a trial can go forward. And if a DSMB stops a trial, they may consult with the FDA. But at the end of the day, the sponsor, if the sponsor has cut off the data flow by stopping a trial prematurely, there are costs and consequences to that.
All right. Well, I think we are at the end of our hour. But I want to thank you both for, again, what has been is not always a transparent, is a little bit murky, I think, to a lot of clinicians, what the whole process is. So not only making that very clear, but really outlining the benefits of the FDA and all the good work that's been done and the challenges in the current climate. So I appreciate it very much.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, and stay engaged and concerned, those of you who are.
And do RCTs.
We're doing our best at Emory.
Yeah, we're trying our best to be involved in the different RCTs. We were involved in Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. We're doing, the Moderna vaccine. We're doing several other, we'll be doing other vaccine studies. But, we are big believers, and our chair of the department, Dr. Stevens, is also one of the co-chairs, one of the co-PIs of the ICDRC, so very involved in this process, and that's why we're very interested in this. So thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thanks.
Take care.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.